I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from every fear. Those who look on him are radiant, they'll never be ashamed, they'll never be ashamed. It's born and cried, and the Lord heard me, and he saved me from my enemies. The Son of God surrounds his saints. He will deliver them. He will deliver them. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, blessed is he who hides in him. Oh, fear the Lord, all of his saints. He'll give you everything. He'll give you everything. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever. Let us bless the Lord every day and night. Never-ending praise, may our incense rise. Let us bless the Lord every day and night. Praise the name of the Lord. Let us bless the Lord every day and night. Praise the name of the Lord. Bless the
Desmond Doss was born in 1919 into a home where it was kind of drilled into him the principle or the belief of nonviolence or pacifism. And that kind of stuck with him his entire life. And surprisingly, when he reached the age of somewhere between 18 and 20, he had some choices to make. He chose to serve in the military, which surprised his family, surprised a lot of people because of this belief that he couldn't carry a weapon. And so he went into the military and he said, I'm going to serve in the military, but I'm not going to carry a weapon, which, as you can imagine, created some problems and some persecution for him and against him early on in his career. But he went on to become a hero. In the Battle of Okinawa, it's estimated he became a medic that he rescued around 75 men from being injured. He kind of dragged them back to safety, all the while never carrying a weapon. And in that process, over those few days, he was injured 4 different times, pretty seriously. He had a broken arm because of a shot that he took. He took a grenade, had 17 pieces of shrapnel in him at one point. Just amazing what he did. And the 2016 movie Hacksaw Ridge told this story of this soldier who said, I will not carry a weapon, but I'll still go to war. And he saved lives, and he was the first person like this who held this belief that we know of to receive the Medal of Honor. Now, I'm left asking, like, why in the world would you go into battle like that without a weapon? Like, that's almost sounds crazy. Like, to make the choice to join the military, go to war as war is kind of ramping up, like to make that choice and then not carry a weapon. But I'll tell you why he did it. His beliefs led him to do that. Why would you go into war without a weapon? Because he held to a belief that pushed him in that direction. Isn't it true that our beliefs deeply impact our actions? Or maybe to kind of reverse the statement, the things that we do often come from our beliefs. Now that's pretty obvious, but you see it in a variety of ways. If you believe that hard work will lead to success, like if you really believe that and you've seen that play out in your life, what are you likely to do? If you believe that, you're likely to work hard. And you're likely to go all in and do everything you can in work and in school because you believe hard work will lead to success. But what if you grew up in a home where you watched your parents work really hard? I mean work super hard all the time, and they never really experienced success, which happens sometimes. Do you think that would impact? Yeah, it would impact you, and it might lead you to say, you know what? Hard work does not lead to success, so why work hard? If it was drilled in you at some point in your life that winning is everything, and so you believe winning is everything, do you think that impacts a kid? Yeah, they will work hard, and it'll sometimes even become this obsession that you gotta win, gotta win, gotta win. If you somehow believe, or for some reason believe that making money is everything, will that impact the way you live? Will that impact the way you act in your job and maybe even your integrity? Yeah. Because our actions are often driven by what we believe to be true. And I think you really see that in the book of Hebrews that we're walking through this year, but you really see it in Hebrews chapter 11. If you have your Bibles, turn them over there. We're in Hebrews chapter 11. If you're a guest with us, or if you're new, or if you're a student, and we're just now diving back into Hebrews, we didn't do this last week, we're walking through Hebrews this year, and the problem with chapter 11, which we came to a couple of weeks ago, is we know this chapter really well. Without even understanding, you probably could quote a couple of verses from this chapter without even trying to memorize it, or without even realizing you could do that, because we know this chapter really well, but we usually know it and quote it out of its context. There's an important context in all of Hebrews that I think it's important to remind us of. Now, if you're here every week for Hebrews, you're tired of hearing about context, but I got to keep coming back to it, right? Hebrews is written to a group of struggling Christians saying, don't give up on Jesus because it's hard. He's greater. Don't go back to Judaism. Jesus is greater. And this has been laid out in this theological argument for 10 chapters, and you get to a chapter 11, and it's like, okay, I've tried to spell this out for you, but now here are some real live concrete examples of what it looks like to not give up and to keep going even when it's hard. And so you just get this story after story after story, 18 times this phrase, by faith. And so we learn what it looks like to not give up even when life is hard. But here's what else I think we see. I think we see over and over again in chapter 11 that our actions are driven by what we believe in. Over and over again. Let me give you a kind of walk through. We're just going to be in verses 4 through 22. Now, here's the problem with this. These are some big Old Testament stories, like pages and pages and pages of your Old Testament. We can't cover every story. We're just going to mention them. We're just going to see what Hebrews has to say about them, all right? And I couldn't help, I gave you this definition 2 weeks ago. So if you missed this is from George Guthrie. This was kind of the definition that helped serve as a foundation to this entire chapter. And this is a definition that Guthrie came up with to explain what's going on in chapter 11. It came from chapter 11. This is what you see. And I think it's valuable enough to read it. We had a great discussion about it in second class. What is faith? It is confidence that results in action. Just stop there, right? confidence that leads to action, carried out in a variety of situations, you're going to see that in chapter 11, by ordinary people in response to the unseen God and his promises with various earthly outcomes. In other words, it's not always going to work out. You get later in the chapter, people are going to be sawn in two, right? This doesn't always lead to good things, but it'll always lead to the ultimate outcome of God's commendation and reward. Now watch how this plays out in the characters we're going to talk about today. Now I couldn't help myself as I thought about all these characters. I had to make a chart. I'm sorry. Maybe the chart's like, a chart in a sermon. I just had to help organize this. And from the moment I started studying, this is like, I got to make a chart out of this. So here we go. You ready for my chart? We're going to start with verse 4. By faith, Abel, there he is. There's my chart. Start on my chart. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Like because of Abel's faith, he's still speaking to us today. Now, the problem with this story of Cain and Abel is the Old Testament does not explicitly tell us why God preferred Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. You can theorize, and preachers will theorize, and you probably have some ideas. The text never tells us, except in Hebrews chapter 11, it appears that Abel's was done by faith. And perhaps then Cain's was not. So maybe what we're dealing with here is a reminder that worship is not just an external action. It's driven by something on the inside. It's driven by faith. And what I want to do is I give you this chart, and I know those are some small words up there. I think with each one of these examples, we learn what faith does, how it takes action. And in this case, faith impacts worship. This is a reminder that you can't just approach God any way that you want to. We learned that Cain tried that, and it didn't work out very well, did it? So from the beginning, we learned something from Abel here. We learned from Abel that faith impacts worship. All right, we keep going. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was found because God had taken him. So the gist of this is, you read back in Genesis, before Enoch died, God took him up into heaven. Now, if you want like a scientific explanation of what that looked like, sorry, I can't explain it. Fascinating story. Learn about it in Genesis chapter 5, but he's taken up into heaven before he died, and apparently it was because of his faith. By faith this happened, the text says. In fact, verse 6 says, kind of gives an explanation. Here's one of those famous verses. The context is this talking about Enoch. And without faith, because his faith pleased God, without faith it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Okay, so we learn from Enoch, you've got to have faith to please God. Now here's what's interesting to me about Enoch, is you go back and read his story in the Old Testament, there's not much there. The Jews have all sorts of traditions, or had all sorts of traditions about Enoch, and had books that he supposedly wrote to kind of spell out this tradition. We know very little from him from the Old Testament scriptures except this. In Genesis 5, 21 to 24, in 4 verses, really just in 3 verses, it says twice that he walked with God. And that for me is the indication of what his faith looked like. Here's what faith does. It does not, in Abel's case, just impact worship. It doesn't just drive us to show up at church on Sunday. Real faith impacts daily relationship with God. Enoch didn't just go to church. Well, I don't know if he went to church anyway, right? But Enoch walked with God, right? This is daily relationship. But we keep going. We could talk about each one of these guys so much. Verse 7, by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So Noah is summarized in one verse, what happens in Genesis, in 4 long chapters, big story. But we learn here it's by faith that he did this thing. And what was the warning? The warning was about things unseen. We could say things that had never been seen up to that point in the history of the world. And so his building an ark in this world looked crazy. So what does faith do? Faith obeys when it doesn't make sense. He was doing something that in his world, in his culture, made absolutely no sense. But by faith, Noah obeyed, didn't he? All right, now we come to Abraham. Now, boy, there's a lot of story with Abraham in the Old Testament, lots and lots of chapters. Here's the summary in Hebrews. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, we would assume, by faith, not knowing where he was going. By faith, verse 9, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. So Abraham obeys, he goes out, and we're left with the question, why? What leads you to do that? And we might expect the answer to be he went out because he looked forward to the land that God was going to take him to. And that'd be reasonable and fair, isn't it? It's not what it says. Look at verse 10. For, here's your why, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He was looking to eternity. Now, the problem here is, in the Old Testament, we don't really know what these earliest characters believed about the afterlife. Very little is said. But Hebrews tells us Abraham believed that God was building a city and that he was going there. And so his driving factor for obeying and going out was not the promised land. It was what God was going to do in the end. That's amazing. So here's what I get from Abraham. Faith goes when results are unseen and unknown. He does not know what he is getting himself into. In the moment, in the next 10 years, and ultimately for eternity, he hasn't seen it. But by faith, he believed what was happening. So he goes even when he can't see. But then we get Sarah, his wife. Verse 11, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So Sarah conceives at 90 years old. Let's just go ahead and acknowledge that, I don't know how to say this really, if one of our elderly women showed up here pregnant, it'd be really awkward, right? Can we just say that like that? Like, we would all be like, there's a movie out, it's on Amazon Prime right now, it came from Angel Studios, His Only Son, and it's the story of Abraham. It's pretty well done, a little long, but they show this elderly woman pregnant, and I remember thinking, this just makes me feel weird, like it makes me feel uncomfortable, right? It doesn't look right, and that's the point, right? That's the point. This is something that is impossible. This doesn't make sense from a common sense factor. And what's the result? Well, look at verse 12. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, so Abraham's nearly dead too, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Incredible what happens here. What does faith do? Faith allows for the impossible. This is impossible what happens. And according to the Hebrews writer, it's by faith that this happened. Now, we're going to skip verses 13 through 16, come back to it later. We're going to keep looking at these examples. So we're going to come back verse 17 to Abraham again, right? By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Incredible story. You know that story. So he's going to offer Isaac on an altar because God told him to. Why? Well, listen to the rest of this. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So in other words, like, this was the promise of God. You're going to have, we go back to verse 12, as many descendants as the stars of the heaven, and now you've asked me to kill the one son you've given me. Why does he do it? Look at verse 19. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. You know why Abraham was going to offer Isaac? Hebrews says it's because he believed that God was going to raise him from the dead after he did it. You know what that takes? That's faith. That's faith. What's faith do? It sacrifices because of a belief in what God is going to do. Now, the last three I feel like we can kind of lump together. So we got Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We'll pick up in verse 20 and read down through 22. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Verse 22, by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Each one of these guys looked to the future and gave blessing and gave instructions without knowing anything about the future except the promises of God. But they apparently believed God was going to fulfill his promises and get this family to the next stage, even though they hadn't seen it themselves. Joseph so boldly, he's like, hey, when you make it to the promised land, here's what you do with my bones. Like, that's incredible. What does faith do? Faith looks to the future. That's what we just said, so we'll say it this way. Faith sees the future differently. We don't look, Christians, people of faith don't look at the future like people who don't have faith. That's pretty obvious. Now, there's my chart, the whole thing, right? Like my chart here. Like, what do you get from this? What are the takeaways just by looking at all these characters, what they do? I mean, one of the things that jumps out at me, back to our definition, is these are drastically different circumstances in each case. And drastically different actions in each case. You've got a really diverse set of circumstances that lead people to do different things. You know what and here's another thing. You go read these guys' stories, they commit some serious sins. If there's such a thing as serious sin from the perspective of humans, like some of these folks did some really serious stuff, even laughing at God's promises. I mean, they make some pretty serious mistakes. And how are they described in Hebrews 11? As people of faith. You know what the one common factor to all this is? You know what's common? Faith. Like, that's the one thing that connects all of these stories. And so I'm still left asking, why? Why do they do all of this? And for me, the answer is right here tucked in the middle in this interlude in the passage, starting in verse 13. Now, I've got it on the screen for you. I want everybody to be sure and see it, but read it from your Bible if you want to. Here's the reasoning. And for me, if I'm asking why do they do what they do, this is not what I would expect, but it is what it is. Here's what Hebrews says. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. Now, that's important. They didn't actually fully experience the promised blessings of God, but they acted believing that they would come to pass. And having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. This is the language of, you know what an exile is, right? An exile is someone who has to leave their country, go to another one, and they don't really want to. They're forced out. So the language here is of people who are living in a place that's not really where they want to be. They're looking to something more. Peter uses this language. 1 Peter 1 verse 1 kicks it off with this letter saying, this is written to the elect exiles. Or chapter 2 verse 11, behold, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. There's a sense in which people of faith are described as exiles. Now watch how he explains this. And I don't want to, let's see, I'll go back a little bit right here. Starting right after our underlined part, for people who speak thus, make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. So if somebody describes themselves as an exile or a sojourner, they say, we're wanting to go back home. But he says, this is a little bit different. He explains it. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they'd gone out, like if Abraham was thinking, I want to go back home, back to that homeland, they would have had an opportunity to return. So Hebrews says, that's not what we're talking about here. This is a different illustration. So listen to what he says. Here's what they're actually looking forward to. Here's the homeland. I guess this would be verse 15 and 16. He says, but as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Like, let that sink in. The reason they did what they did, according to Hebrews, is because they were looking to heaven. Now, that's tricky because Genesis doesn't say anything about really the afterlife. Very little about the afterlife, at least. And here are these patriarchs who says they do what they do because they're looking to a better country that God is preparing. And it wraps up, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So why do they do what they do? The answer is, according to Hebrews, they do what they do because they're looking into the unseen future and they're looking to eternity, and that motivates them to take action. That faith in God's promises motivates them to take action. Like we said earlier, sometimes often our behavior is driven by what we believe. For example, I know nobody in this room would ever do this. Do you believe that some men yell at a TV when they're watching a ball game? I don't know. Nobody here would do that. I mean, I don't know if there's any Florida State fans in here. You might have done this yesterday, right? You might have yelled at the TV. Like, why do some people, none of us, yell at a television screen? Because they believe something, right? They believe that their team is maybe not the best, but they believe something about that team and they're passionate about it. And that belief and passion leads us to do certain things, even if it's kind of strange. Can you believe, and nobody in here would do this, can you believe there are college students who like paint their bodies up and then they like wear all the same color? And get this, they run around a college campus with no real purpose. They're just like running around and they're all painted up. Like, why would anybody do that, right? Because you did it and you believe something about this club thing, right? You believe that your club is fun and that freshmen should join your club. And so you do something that, from the perspective of an outsider, like doesn't make much sense, right? Because your belief drives you to action. As I read this text in Hebrews chapter 11, and these incredible stories of people who do things that don't make sense, here's the big idea I get away from it. As I look at all of this, here it is. Obedience now is fueled by faith in an unseen future. That's what I want you to hear this morning. Obedience in this moment, and for them, obedience in their moment was fueled by faith in a future that they couldn't see. In other words, to use a line we've heard many times, we walk by faith, not by sight. The problem is, in our current circumstances, boy, we love what we see, don't we? We got a lot of blessings. There's a lot of shiny, good, cool stuff around us, and it's really easy to be drawn in only by what we see. But these guys remind us it's not just about what we see. It's about the unseen. It's about faith in what we can't currently see. And so what I learned from this passage is obedience now is fueled by faith in an unseen future. What's that look like for you? What does obedience, and here's what we learned from this passage. It's going to look different for everybody, right? But if you really believe in what God's going to provide for us in eternity, in an unseen future, what do you need to do? What would you do now? Well, here's a couple of ideas. I think heartfelt worship is fueled by faith in an unseen future. I miss Miss Wanda Torres. I warned them ahead of time where I was going to mention them. She'd always sit down here on the second row with Tony and Tammy, and boy, she would worship with all her heart. Now, you might say, well, that was the Alzheimer's, and maybe some of it, but you know what that was driven by? Faith in an unseen future. And here's what else, because of that faith, and because, again, of where she was in life, she didn't care what other people thought, right? And so she just worshiped God and wasn't concerned with what other people thought or what other people were looking at her. She didn't care. She just knew that she was worshiping God and she had something ahead of her that was better beyond anything we can imagine. Boy, what if I wish we all worshiped like that. If our worship was driven by faith in what we really are going to experience someday. Imagine the difference that would make in the way that we worship. What are you modeling? By the way you worship, what are you modeling to your family? To the people that sit around you? Now, this isn't about externals or anything like that, but it's just a reminder that if we really believe what we sang before the sermon, wow, it's going to make a difference in the way that we worship. I think daily walk with God, as we learned from Enoch, he walked with God. Daily walk with God is fueled by faith in an unseen future. I have a friend in Middle Tennessee, and students, her kids are students at Freed, at least a couple of them, and she's facing a really, really tough battle with cancer. And it's been amazing to watch her faith. She came to Horizon. She's still trying to teach, but she's just it's one of those bad cases of cancer, a bad type of, they're all bad, but it's one of those tough ones. And it's amazing to watch someone like that in their daily walk with God, because, yeah, we could talk about daily walk with God. You know when this is tested, right? When things aren't going well. That's when you see this. And so just this week she posted this, and I wanted you to see this. She said, "Hello, sweet prayer warriors. You've pleaded with God and he delivered over and over again. At times it hasn't been easy at all. Other times I forget that I have this disease in my body, but I have learned to thank God for the good and for the bad. Why do I thank him for the bad? These are the times where I can really feel him carrying me because I am relying on him even more. That is when he sends his saints to minister to me, which deepens my relationship with them. It's in those times when I remind myself that not a single one of us is promised a tomorrow. This chorus rings in my head often. Many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand, but I know who holds tomorrow, future, and I know who holds my hand. What is it that drives that attitude? I'll tell you what it is. It's faith in an unseen future that allows us to experience intimacy and daily walk with God in spite of the challenges. Obedience that doesn't make sense is fueled by faith in an unseen future. You ever, I don't know if this happened to you, but you ever, when you were growing up, when you're a teenager, middle school, whatever, you ever leave a ball game to go to church? You ever do that? I don't know if, we did that a few times, and it's awkward, and people don't understand. I will never forget the time we were leaving a ball game on a Wednesday night to go to church, and Mom, do you remember there was an older player that was like, he came out of the dugout and he was like, "Mrs. Cook, please," because I was just that valuable, right? What can I say? And it was mortifying. Like, he came out like it was kind of up a hill. He's like, "Mrs. Cook, please." They didn't understand, right? They didn't understand. Why would you leave a ball game? It's just a Wednesday night. Why would you ever do that? I'll tell you why. Faith in an unseen future leads you to do things, leads you to obey in ways that people don't get. It doesn't make sense to people. I don't know. It's faith do. It's going even when the results are unknown or unseen is fueled by faith in an unseen future. Kind of like Abraham. You remember back in May, it was our missionary in residence last year at Freed Hardeman, but Wayne Parker came and spoke to us on a Wednesday night and told us about how his family was going to Cyprus. We helped them financially. They went over the summer for 6 or 7 weeks to kind of get the lay of the land, and then this week they moved there. And I have to share his post because it's kind of funny. Here's what he said. He said, "We made it to Cyprus. It was a lot of work. I do not recommend traveling with 22 suitcases, 4 30-pound backpacks, 4 full carry-ons, and 2 dogs in their travel crates. Ever. We started with it all loaded in our expedition, which I drove to New York. From there, we flew to Athens, Greece, and then on to Cyprus. Each flight had different baggage rules and regulations. So we, mostly Christy, did a lot of repacking. Just in case you don't know, my wife is amazing. Here's the other piece that his wife posted. When they got to the house that they rented, the landlords were still living in it." It's so tough, but it's also kind of funny. If you know his personality, he would be fine with us laughing at it. Why do you do stuff like that? Why would you put yourself through that kind of travel and trauma and change? Because of faith in an unseen future. That's why. And so I don't know, maybe for those of you who are a little younger, what the future holds for you, but I would challenge you to think about stepping out of your comfort zone. Why? Why would you do that? Because you got faith in an unseen future. I think this is a reminder that impossible results are fueled by faith in an unseen future. 10 years ago, if you were at Stantonville 10 years ago, would you have imagined this? No. If somebody said, "Hey, this is what it's going to look like in 2024, we might have been like Sarah and laughed at him, right? What's this indicate? God does the impossible, right? Impossible results are fueled by faith in an unseen future. This is about people you think about sharing your faith with. There are people that you may think they would never. They would never. You know, there's probably some folks in here right now who are Christians that other people thought they would never. They would never. Faith says, boy, God's capable of what I think to be impossible. Sacrifice, like Abraham, sacrifice is fueled by faith in an unseen future. We are using 2 buildings that have been built, one in the past year, one in the past 6 years, been here 6 years, probably about this weekend, that are completely paid off. How's that happen? Why would people make those kind of sacrifices? I'll tell you why. They're not just looking at the here and now, and they're not just looking at their checkbooks driven by the here and now. It is faith in an unseen future that drives people to make sacrifices that are amazing. And then last, so I think about Jacob and Isaac and Joseph, and they're looking to the future. And this one might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think spiritual planning and see you later living are fueled by faith in an unseen future. Anybody who makes plans for the future spiritually, why do they do that? It's by faith. But what about the see you later living? You ever heard somebody say, maybe as they're about to die, or maybe they know they're going somewhere they're not going to see people, or or people talk about stuff like this in funerals and we say, it's not goodbye, it's see you later. You know, that sounds absolutely foolish to people who don't have faith. It's foolish. But for us, it's hope. We believe this and we say that, and we're able to say that because of faith in an unseen future. So, what I want you to hear from these amazing characters in Hebrews chapter 11 is obedience now, according to verse 13 through 16, I think it gives us the answer. Obedience now is fueled by faith in an unseen future. We walk by faith, not by sight. It's a story of a girl who was tired of life at home. And so she wanted to get out. She wanted to get far, far away from home. And so circumstances led her to that, and she experienced this incredible journey with colorful characters. You actually know who I'm talking about. This is her, right? Dorothy. She wanted to get away, and she wanted to be somewhere over the rainbow. And then once she got somewhere over the rainbow, she said, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto, right? And so she experiences this amazing journey, and you would say she enjoyed a lot of the journey. She made great connections, but you get to the end of the movie, and what does she say? She gives this, one of the most famous lines in cinematic history. There's no place like home. Listen, I think like Dorothy, in this adventure and journey of life, there's a lot of good to experience. What we're doing this morning, it's beautiful, and there's so much we enjoy in this. There's a lot to enjoy. But what drives us, sometimes even to radical obedience, is not what we see when we look around us. It's faith in an invisible God. And it's faith in an unseen future. Obedience now is fueled by faith in an unseen future. We walk by faith, not by sight. Why? Because there's no place like home. If we can help you in your relationship with God, we'd love to do so now. We stand.